November 13, 1942, 0210. Ironbottom Sound, Guadalcanal. A black slice of ocean cut by thin lines of phosphorescence where propellers churn the sea. The air tastes of salt and diesel. The deck planks underfoot glow faintly with condensation. Somewhere to starboard, a depth charge's wake fizzles. Somewhere forward, a ship's exhaust coughs into the night. Men move like shadows, voices clipped, breath held. You could hear the tiny clink of a wrench dropped 3 decks below. And for a moment, every man on the bridge thought it was the sound of engines dying. On the bridge of the destroyer USS Clemency, 27 knots, course east by north, Lieutenant Commander James Avery leaned over his chart table. His face was a map of fatigue. A week's worth of salt-stiff hair, small angry cuts from rusty railings, eyes hollow but hard. He could see his own breath in the lamplight and the vague silhouette of Guadalcanal to the west. Behind him, the radio room hummed. Behind that, in a cramped, dim compartment aft, a glass-screened box glowed bluish and impossible. The ship's SG surface search radar. Petty Officer First Class Miguel Santos sat with gloved hands on the receiver, knuckles white where they touched the knobs. He had the steady, cramped patience of men who spend nights searching black screens for the flicker that means life or death. The radar's cathode ray tube threw up a circular sweep. Tiny blips and arcs plotted onto luminous phosphor. Tonight the blips were few and the arcs tight. A calm night for a place that had not granted the luxury of calm in months. Range rings steady at 10, 20, 30, Santos murmured, more to himself than to anyone. He'd been mocked at the mess hall earlier that week. Older chiefs wagging their heads about the newfangled eye that couldn't look like a human one. Radar? Pah! Give me a lookout with eyes like a hawk, one of them had said. The laughter had been easy and brittle, a way men keep fear manageable. The Japanese, when they could, laughed too, confident that their night training, their optics, their pikes of surprise, made them kings of the dark. Avery remembered that talk now and felt the old animal knot of skepticism. You don't replace sight with glass, you bargain with it. You learn its lies and its truths. Tonight the bargain made a small, clear sound. A bell in the radio room, 3 short tones, then a burst of low, excited talk over the ship's internal circuit. Santos's hand tightened. A blip appeared on the rim of the CRT. Not a single point but a smear. A seam. He nudged the range dial. The sweep tightened, the smear grew to a definable contact. Bearing 320 relative range, 90 miles, he said, voice flat because the words themselves could clip off into superstition if said too loud. 90. The instrument's manual told them nominal ranges. The sea and weather and the enemy all conspired to make those numbers pliable. 90 miles tonight was a number that made men straighten. Repeat, Avery said without moving, the map almost forgotten under his palm. He tasted copper on his tongue. The ship's captain was a few steps to port, a wedge of stern jaw and faded stripes. Commander Harold Leland, steady as ballast. He walked the bridge like a man measuring the horizon with a ruler. Santos's second tone came, then the third. Contact bearing 322, range 190. Avery looked at Leland. Leland's eyes were small, and for a beat they shivered with something like disbelief. 190, he echoed. You mean SG is reading 190, Santos said. He felt foolish and suddenly like a prophet. The scope's trace was stubbornly there, a pale finger on the rim. He could already hear the old jokes. Radar can't see 190 miles, not in the same tone. But instruments do things instruments do. Below, the engine room's clanks fell into a new rhythm. The signalman on the fantail struck the code to the Combat Information Center upstairs. On the mast, the new radio telegraph purred. Messages crackled. The carrier group to the north had reported surface echoes. An inexperienced pilot had seen flashes against the clouds. And somewhere beyond the blackness, Japanese voices were steering toward a target they believed blind. Across the sound, aboard a Japanese light cruiser, a low-slung silhouette, officers in white caps laughed softly into their cigarette smoke. They had trained for nights like this. Their optics were razor-sharp, and their doctrine said the American Navy fled at night. Radios were noisy. The sea was matter for the brave, not mechanized ghosts. They envied the night. They mocked the idea that a screen, a glowing disk, could tell them the secrets of night. But the ocean does not answer to doctrine. It answers to metal and the way waves carry sound and to the hex of weather, and the stubborn brilliance of a glass tube pushed to its limits. Plot them relative to Guadalcanal, Leland ordered. His voice made the men move like a hive. Maps were unrolled, pencil point scratches traced the bearing, and a small, careful line connected two blue pencil marks: Clemency's position and the radar contact. If the hit held, if the reading was not a mirage, a Japanese fleet was threading through the dark in a position to intercept transports and cover a bombardment run. The captain's hand hovered above the map like a judge ready to bang the gavel. In the radio room, young signalmen tapped the encoded alerts into the net. The word radar drifted through the chain like a foreign coin, unfamiliar, valuable, dangerous. Men who had been skeptical or amused or indifferent found themselves listening, leaning as if to hear the instrument's voice better. "Prepare action stations. Sound general quarters," Leland said. There was no flourish in it, merely the clean, inevitable command of a man who had felt the teeth of the night at his throat more than once. Outside, the sea swallowed the order and carried it. Wave crests broke, muffled like a breath held. The SG screen kept its steady pulse, a luminous planet wheel by which the Clemency and the nearby ships navigated the unseen. Radar, which some had mocked as a toy for the timid, had just spoken a number that could change everything. Men looked at each other, and for an instant the humor washed away. This device that some officers had dismissed as an overreach of science was not a spectator. It was an early warning, an extra pair of eyes trained on the dark. "Cover our transports," Avery muttered, more to himself than anyone. He felt the old, slow swell of fear mixed with the thrill that had kept men at sea for centuries. The sense that in knowledge lay a chance, and in surprise lay doom. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese commanders continued to joke about radar. Tonight, though, the water between them and the island would no longer be an honest, unknowable black. The instrument's 13-inch face continued its silent sweep, indifferent to ranks and ridicule, mapping the future one pale blip at a time. The order to sound general quarters rolled through the ship like an electric pulse. Klaxons wailed, boots thudded against steel decks, and the muted shuffle of men snapping into their battle stations replaced the low murmur of the night. The USS Clemency came alive, a living thing of gears, wires, and heartbeat. Every man aboard knew that the difference between life and a watery grave could be measured in seconds and inches. In the radar compartment, the air was now thick and hot, a haze of cigarette smoke curling beneath red battle lamps. The radar's hum felt almost sentient, its sweep casting shadows on the walls like the blink of a colossal mechanical eye. Petty Officer Santos adjusted the gain, squinting through sweat and static. Contacts. Still multiple. Range. Now 175. Looks like they're closing fast, sir. Lieutenant Avery leaned closer, studying the faint constellation of moving blips. "Heading straight for the transport lanes," he said quietly. His voice carried that low tone of disbelief. That radar could see them. That this phantom smear was a fleet of ships tearing through the black water beyond the reach of any human eye. Above them on the bridge, Commander Leland's voice cut through the intercom. "Pass word to Helena and San Francisco. Plot intercept. Radar control to coordinate firing solutions. Radar control." The words were new, even strange. A few months earlier, that phrase hadn't existed in naval doctrine. Battles were fought by sight, by the flash of gunfire and the moon's reflection on the water. But tonight, for the first time in naval history, the U.S. Navy was preparing to fight a surface battle using radar as its eyes. To the west, aboard the Japanese cruiser Sendai, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka studied the faint glow of phosphorescent waves curling beneath his ship's bow. He was proud. His men were the best-trained night fighters in the world. For decades, the Imperial Navy had practiced nocturnal attacks with deadly precision, relying on superior optics, discipline, and a doctrine that made the night their ally. The Americans, they believed, were clumsy in darkness, slaves to their searchlights, too afraid to fight without the sun. A young officer on Sendai's bridge pointed toward the west. "Sir, intelligence reports the enemy has radar. Shall we consider it?" Tanaka's lips curled slightly. "American magic," he said. "We will see if their toys can find us in the dark." The officers chuckled. Their destroyers fanned out into attack formation, a crescent of speed and torpedo power. In minutes, they would unleash a storm of Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, the most feared in the world. But the Americans were already watching them, not with binoculars or spotlights, but through invisible waves bouncing off metal hulls hundreds of miles away. Aboard Helena, an SG radar operator named Seaman Second Class Bill Watson felt his palms sweat as the sweep lit up more blips than he had ever seen. Multiple ships bearing 185 true. Range 165, he called out. The blips marched inward, forming a crescent like a spear point. Plot it, ordered Captain Gilbert Hoover. Tell San Francisco we've got them. And tell them, this isn't ghosts. Below decks, the Combat Information Center, CIC, a small, dimly lit room packed with cables, charts, and the smell of ozone, became the nervous system of the fleet. Officers scribbled bearings, ranges, and estimates in chalk on blackboards, while others updated the captain's plot in real time. It was the first time radar and human intuition were working together in combat, the first glimpse of what modern naval warfare would become. Range, closing to 150, came the voice from Clemency. Confirmed, said Helena. We make 12 large contacts, likely cruisers and destroyers. Commander Leland's reply was simple. Then let's welcome them. The sea outside was still pitch black. The Japanese ships glided forward, expecting to strike first. In their minds, they were predators approaching blind prey. But in truth, they were already inside a kill zone they didn't know existed. The Americans didn't need moonlight. They didn't need to see their enemies. They already had them marked, glowing, tracked, predicted. At 0220, the CIC transmitted firing coordinates. The data leapt from radar to plotting table to turret. Numbers turned into steel and fire. Open fire, Leland ordered. The night exploded. From the guns of San Francisco, Helena, and the destroyer line came a roar that tore the sky open. The first salvos were impossibly accurate, shells slamming into unseen targets over 10 miles away. Sparks and fireballs lit the horizon where moments before there had been nothing but darkness. On the Sendai, chaos erupted. Lookouts screamed bearings that made no sense. The Americans were firing without light, without visual contact. Tanaka shouted for target confirmation, but there was none. The night, once their ally, was betraying them. Back aboard the Clemency, Santos stared at the radar as new shapes appeared, breaking apart, fading, reforming. Hits confirmed, he said, his voice trembling. Multiple explosions. They're scattered. Avery felt a strange, fierce calm. The radar had not lied. For the first time, the Americans weren't groping in the dark. They were the ones who saw everything. The Pacific had turned into a map of echoes and pulses. And for the Japanese, every move was now being watched by an invisible enemy. Radar had just redrawn the battlefield, and no one, not even those watching its glow, fully understood how much the world had just changed. 225 hours. Ironbottom Sound had become a furnace. Shells screamed across the water, tearing white arcs through the dark. The thunder of naval guns rolled between the islands like the beating of some vast, angry heart. The U.S. task force under cruisers San Francisco, Helena, Portland, and destroyers like Clemency and Sterret moved as if guided by a single mind. Radar fed them sight where the human eye saw nothing. Every bearing correction, every range adjustment came from the ghostly green sweep of the SG sets buried deep within their hulls. Aboard the Helena, the gunnery officer barked into his headset. Target number 2. Bearing confirmed. Fire by radar solution. A pause, then a ripple of gunfire as the forward turrets opened up. The radar trace flickered, and then one of the enemy blips vanished. A moment later, through binoculars, faint orange tongues of flame licked at the horizon. Hit confirmed, said the radar operator, almost in disbelief. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese cruiser Furutaka, the deck was chaos. Officers shouted bearings, but their data conflicted. No visual contact, cried a young ensign. But the Americans are firing. How? Rear Admiral Tanaka gritted his teeth. They have found us. How is that possible? The Japanese fleet had trained for night attacks since before most of the American sailors had been born. They had mastered torpedo tactics, perfected signal coordination under moonless skies, and believed themselves untouchable in darkness. But now, invisible shells were ripping into their formation. Ships that had been invisible a minute ago were burning torches the next. On the Sendai, an officer shouted, "They fire through the fog. They do not miss." Tanaka said nothing. He knew instinctively what this meant. Somewhere across that black expanse, the Americans had found a way to see them. Not with eyes, but with something else. something that shattered the old rules of naval war. Back on Clemency, the radar compartment was a storm of voices. Santos wiped sweat from his brow, eyes fixed on the screen. Multiple contacts still closing from the northwest. Destroyers fast. Lieutenant Avery shouted toward the bridge. "They're trying to flank us!" Commander Leland didn't hesitate. "Tell the Starrett and O'Bannon to intercept. Radar-directed fire only." Through the static and gunfire, the orders passed. In a war that had been defined by confusion, by the blindness of night and the chaos of the sea, this coordination was something new, something lethal. The destroyer Starrett turned hard to port, guided entirely by radar readings. No one could see the enemy. They trusted the machine. The SG operator called out bearings like a heartbeat. 110, range 6,000, 5,000, 4,000. Then the forward guns barked. Tracers vanished into the black. Moments later, a bloom of fire erupted to port. One of Tanaka's destroyers, a Katsuki, had taken a direct hit amidships. She split apart in seconds, her torpedoes detonating in a blinding flash that lit the sea for miles. Sailors aboard Clemency shielded their eyes. For a heartbeat, the entire battlefield was visible. Ships, smoke, chaos, men clinging to the rails, and the black silhouettes of enemy vessels racing to their doom. When the light died, radar saw what human eyes could not. The Japanese formation breaking apart, their precision undone. On the bridge, Commander Leland's voice was quiet but certain. "They can't hide anymore," he said. The irony was stark. For months, Japanese commanders had mocked the American obsession with electronics, calling radar a toy for cowards. But now, those same commanders were being hunted by that toy, their movements plotted with scientific precision, their ships illuminated not by light but by mathematics. Avery leaned over the chart. "We've got another cruiser. Bearing 285, range 8,000. She's turning away." "Helena," Leland said into the radio. "Finish her." Seconds later, Helena's radar plot matched the target, and the guns opened up again. The ocean shook. A deep metallic boom rolled across the sound. A second Japanese cruiser vanished from the radar sweep, gone beneath the surface before the men firing had ever seen her. By 03:00, the Japanese fleet was in full retreat. Fires burned across the water like drifting suns. The U.S. task force had taken damage. San Francisco's bridge was shattered. Several destroyers hit. But the balance had shifted. For the first time in the Pacific War, the U.S. Navy had fought a night battle not by luck or courage alone, but by technology, by information. In the radar room of the Clemency, Santos stared at the now mostly empty sweep. Only faint echoes remained. He exhaled, his voice small and hoarse. "They're running." Lieutenant Avery nodded. "And they'll never mock radar again." But deep down he knew this was just the beginning. The Japanese would adapt. The ocean still had long nights ahead. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Americans had pierced the darkness, and nothing would ever make them blind again. Outside, dawn began to touch the horizon, a faint gray blush over a sea still smoldering with oil and fire. The silhouettes of burning ships dotted the sound, each one a tomb, each one a lesson. And in that pale new light, the green glow of radar still pulsed. Steady, unblinking, eternal. November 14th, 1942. Dawn bled into the horizon like a wound reopening. The sea steamed with the smoke of burning ships, and the air was thick with the oily tang of cordite. Around Ironbottom Sound, the silhouettes of wreckage drifted silently, steel skeletons of cruisers and destroyers that only hours before had been proud, instruments of war, the U.S. sailors on the Clemency. Watched the light grow over the smoldering chaos. For the first time in months, they could stand on deck without feeling hunted. Yet the relief was bitter. The battle had been won, barely, but the cost was written in the blackened scars along their hull and the hundreds of empty bunks below. Lieutenant Avery leaned on the rail, his uniform soaked in spray, watching as the wreck of a Japanese destroyer rolled belly up in the distance. "All that," he murmured, "because of a green line on a screen." Petty Officer Santos, still smelling of smoke and ozone from the radar room, nodded slowly. "Sir, it's strange. We never saw them, not really. Just blips, just echoes. And now they're gone." "Echoes that kill," Avery said quietly. Behind them, Commander Leland stood with the executive officer, receiving the latest reports. Radar operators across the task force were feeding in new data, confirming that the remaining Japanese ships were withdrawing to the north. Their retreat meant more than a tactical victory. It meant the island of Guadalcanal for the first time would not fall under bombardment that night. For months, the Marines dug in around Henderson Field had endured nightly shelling. Japanese cruisers would slip in under the cover of darkness, unload hundreds of high-explosive shells and vanish before dawn. It had been called the Tokyo Express, and it had nearly broken the defenders. But now radar had turned their own weapon in the night against them. At dawn, General Alexander Vandegrift received the coded message. Enemy turned back. Transport safe. Ironbottom clear. He read it twice, barely believing. "We've lived through the night," he said, exhaling through a cracked smile. As the sun climbed higher, U.S. reconnaissance planes from Henderson Field lifted into the humid air, slow, lumbering SBD Dauntlesses and F-4F Wildcats, to hunt down what remained of the Japanese fleet. The pilots, too, had heard of radar, though most had never seen it. The black boxes that see through clouds, they called them. They joked about it half in awe, half in disbelief. But that morning, when they spotted oil trails stretching like dark veins across the water, they realized how deeply those invisible eyes had changed the game. Meanwhile, far to the north aboard the surviving Japanese destroyer Shigure, Rear Admiral Tanaka sat in silence. His ships were gone. He could taste the smoke of his own burning fleet. Every doctrine, every night drill, every assumption about the Americans' blindness shattered in one night. His staff officer approached timidly. "Admiral, the Americans must have spotted us by aircraft. Perhaps by luck?" Tanaka turned, his voice low, measured. "Luck does not fire through darkness with such precision. They saw us somehow. I will not call it luck." He looked out across the gray sea. Perhaps. Their machines have become eyes. The phrase stuck with him, machines have become eyes. In the days that followed, reports filtered back to Tokyo. The Imperial Navy's high command dismissed the first claims of American radar fire control as exaggerated. "Their devices cannot track ships at that distance," one admiral insisted. "It is a sailor's myth." But survivors from Sendai and Akatsuki told the same story. They had been hit before they even sighted muzzle flashes. The mocking stopped. Quietly, engineers in Kure and Yokosuka were told to study radio detection systems. But Japan had entered that race too late. At Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy began to refine its radar tactics. What had been experimental the week before was now doctrine. The Combat Information Center became standard on every major ship. Radar bearings were no longer suggestions. They were gospel. Crews trained to interpret the signals, to translate echoes into action. On Clemency, Santos spent hours staring at the blank scope, learning the rhythm of the sea's background noise, the faint echoes of rain, birds, even the coastline. He could tell a destroyer from a cruiser by the shape of its trace, by how the blip moved through the sweep. "It's like learning to see again," he told Avery one evening. Only this time, through someone else's eyes. Avery smiled faintly. "No, through our own. We just never knew how blind we were." By the end of November, the Americans had turned their newfound vision into dominance. Radar picket ships guarded the approaches, destroyers patrolled by instrument, and the Japanese began to fear what they could no longer hide from. Still, the sea demanded payment. Each night battle took lives, both sides learning, adapting, improvising. But for the Americans, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer reacting to enemy movements. They were anticipating them. As the tropical sun burned through the haze, Commander Leland gathered his officers on the bridge. "Remember this," he said, his voice rough from smoke and fatigue. "This isn't just a new weapon. It's a new way of fighting. The enemy doesn't know it yet, but the night belongs to us now." No one spoke for a long while. The men watched as the wreckage of the Japanese ship smoldered on the horizon. The ocean was calm again, deceptively so. In the distance, Henderson Field's planes returned from their hunt, trailing the rising sun. And on the Clemency, in a small humming room below deck, a green line continued its endless rotation, marking time, measuring distance, watching. Radar had not just won a battle. It had rewritten the laws of naval warfare. December 1942. The rains had come to Guadalcanal, thick tropical curtains that blurred horizon from sky, drenching the battered island in a constant humming downpour. The smell of wet earth mixed with the metallic tang of rust and diesel. The U.S. Navy had dug in around its newfound foothold, patching ships, tending wounds, and studying the strange new weapon that had saved them. Inside a damp tent near the shore, a cluster of officers huddled around a crude wooden table. The room buzzed with low voices and the occasional crackle of a radio. On the table lay maps, grease pencil diagrams, and a single black and white photograph of a radar scope glowing with the telltale green arc. Captain Gilbert Hoover from the cruiser Helena traced a line across the chart. Here, this is where radar made the difference. We opened fire before their lead ship even cleared the headland. Across from him, Commander Leland of the Clemency nodded. They didn't even know we were there. Their optics saw nothing. Our screen saw everything. Lieutenant Commander James Avery leaned forward, flipping open his notebook. Gentlemen, what we did that night wasn't luck. We used radar to coordinate firing solutions across multiple ships. Real-time tracking, not guesswork. We fought blind, but we weren't blind. For a moment, the tent filled only with the sound of rain hammering canvas. Then Hoover said what everyone was thinking. So this is it, then. The night battles belong to us now. Leland gave a grim smile. If we're smart enough to keep learning, yes. From that humble table on Guadalcanal, the U.S. Navy began formalizing its radar doctrine. Engineers from Pearl Harbor and Washington poured into the Pacific, wiring ships with improved sets, training operators, and transforming the once mysterious black boxes into essential organs of command. Each radar operator learned to interpret the faint distortions of the sweep, to know the difference between a weather echo and an enemy destroyer. The men who once mocked the machines now stood behind them in reverent silence, watching the ocean reveal its secrets in green light. Petty Officer Santos, now promoted and respected, trained new crews aboard the Clemency. Don't trust your gut, he'd say. Trust the screen. The gut lies in the dark. The screen doesn't. To the young sailors, radar became a kind of superstition, a mechanical oracle that whispered warnings before disaster struck. They called it the ghost eye or the third sight, but radar's gift came with weight. The more they saw, the more they had to act upon. Battles once decided by minutes of confusion now turned on seconds of precision. Commanders carried that burden heavily. By early 1943, the Japanese Navy had begun to understand. Their night superiority, the edge they'd honed for decades, was gone. Reports from surviving officers told of being ambushed from miles away, of ships exploding before they could even fire a torpedo. In Tokyo, researchers scrambled to develop radar sets of their own. But Japan's industrial base, already strained, could not match the speed or scale of American innovation. While the Imperial Navy was wiring its first crude systems, U.S. ships were already installing radar-directed fire control, systems that not only saw the enemy, but guided shells toward them. At sea, this advantage became devastating. When the U.S. Navy returned to Ironbottom Sound in 1943, the battles had changed. Radar picket destroyers formed a wall around the fleet, detecting incoming aircraft hours before they arrived. The days of surprise attacks were ending. The invisible strikes of Japanese bombers and destroyers now had a counter. Early warning. Interception, preemptive fire. On one gray morning, Commander Leland stood beside Avery on the bridge as the new SG-1A radar hummed. "You can't sneak up on us anymore," Leland said quietly, watching the steady pulse of the sweep. "Not out here." "Not anywhere." Avery nodded. "They'll still try." "Oh, they will," Leland replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "But they're fighting the future now, and the future doesn't sleep." Across the Pacific, from the Solomons to the Aleutians, radar began to rewrite the rhythm of war. Convoys that once vanished into fog now arrived safely. Carriers that might have been caught unprepared now launched fighters in time. Pilots used ground-based radar to land through storms. Submarines used it to detect escorts in the dark. The change was so profound that some sailors began to feel uneasy, as if the mystery of the sea was being stripped away. "We used to fight the ocean," one old chief said. "Now we just measure it." Yet when the next great test came, in the waters, off the Philippines and Leyte Gulf, it would be Radar that saved entire fleets from annihilation. Back, in the cramped radar room of the Clemency, Santos watched the endless sweep trace another rotation. Funny thing, he muttered to a new recruit. They used to laugh at this, said it couldn't replace eyes, but it doesn't have to replace them, just see what eyes can't. The recruit asked, "And what's that?" Santos smiled faintly. "The future." The machine's hum filled the silence. Outside, thunder rolled over the Pacific, echoing like distant gunfire. The war was far from over, but the darkness no longer belonged to the enemy. May 1945, Okinawa. The sea burned again, this time with kamikazes, rockets, and the grinding inevitability of total war. Yet even amid the chaos, the same low hum of radar filled the air aboard American ships. Its sound was no longer strange. It was as familiar as the throb of engines, as constant as the sea itself. On the destroyer USS Clemency, Lieutenant Commander James Avery leaned against the rail, looking over the night-lit waters of the East China Sea. The sky glowed faintly orange where anti-aircraft shells burst high above. Radar stations up and down the fleet fed a ceaseless flow of information to the flagships. Bearings, altitudes, wave echoes. The war had become a symphony of signals. Inside the Clemency's Combat Information Center, Petty Officer Santos, now Chief Santos, sat before a console twice as advanced as the one he'd first touched at Guadalcanal. The screen was sharper now, the range greater. The green sweep showed aircraft hundreds of miles away, tiny sparks crawling toward Okinawa from the north. Contacts. Multiple. Bearing 035 range. 200 miles, he said steadily. Avery entered the compartment, his voice calm but edged with tension. 200 miles? That's well past visual. Yes, sir, Santos said. But they're coming straight in fast, looks like a strike wave. In another era, just 3 years ago, those words would have meant panic. But now they meant preparation. Avery turned toward the communications officer. Relay to KP Command on Vector Fighters intercept at 140. Alert Task Force 58. The message leapt from ship to ship, from radar antenna to radio mast, traveling faster than any plane could fly. Minutes later, American Hellcats were climbing into the night, their own onboard radar sets guiding them through clouds to meet the unseen enemy. Outside, lightning flickered across the horizon, nature's own radar, flashing in sympathy. Santos adjusted the gain. Contacts splitting, some descending. Copy, Avery said. They'll hit the outer picket first. Sure enough, moments later, the picket destroyer Laffey called out on the net. Bandits sighted. Engaging! Then came the faint rumble of distant gunfire, carried through the damp air. Radar tracked every moment. The blips of enemy planes faded one by one. Santos leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Feels like cheating sometimes. Avery gave a small smile. No. It's just the first time the dark's not on their side. He thought back to that first night at Guadalcanal, to the disbelief, the sweat, the green glow of the early SG set showing contacts that shouldn't have been possible. Back then, radar had felt like sorcery. Now it was survival. The Japanese fleet no longer mocked the Americans' technology. They feared it. What they once called American magic had become a weapon more powerful than any gun. It was everywhere, mounted on ships, planes, even portable units carried ashore. Entire divisions moved by radar guidance now. The Allies had built an empire of invisible light, and it watched everything. When the war ended 3 months later, the world emerged into an uneasy dawn. Cities lay in ruins, empires shattered. But among the lessons of fire and loss, one quiet truth endured. That knowledge, not just courage, had won the war. In 1946, as the Clemency returned home, her radar sets were still humming, their screens faintly glowing against the dawn off San Diego. Santos stood before them one last time, fingertips brushing the glass. You brought us home, old girl, he whispered. Lieutenant Commander Avery joined him. The two men stood in silence as the green line swept across the scope. One last rotation. Funny, Avery said. When this war started, we didn't even believe this thing worked. Santos smiled. And now we can't fight without it. He shut the set down. The hum faded, leaving only the sound of gulls outside and the creak of dock ropes. The silence felt enormous, not empty, but earned. Above them, the California sky was pale and endless. The kind of daylight that once seemed impossible in those black Pacific nights. The machine that had once turned darkness into daylight now rested quietly, its glow gone but its legacy permanent. From that point forward, every ship that went to sea would carry radar. Every pilot, every soldier would fight guided by invisible eyes. The world would never again go to war blind. As the Clemency's crew disembarked, Santos looked back one last time at the radar mast gleaming in the morning sun. He could almost hear its faint pulse echoing through time, a reminder of the night when laughter turned to awe, when the unseen became seen, and when the tide of war changed forever.